That's the temperature reading that Nvidia wants you to see, but it's not the hottest temperature reading on one of the sensors on the GPU. But if you're on a 50 series Nvidia GPU with this generation, for whatever reason, I can't really think of a good consumer-friendly reason, Nvidia decided to not enable access to the hotspot temperature readings on the GPUs. And I reported on this recently where we had examples of 5070 Ti's that showed a low 70s or even high 60s reading for their publicly accessible temperature reading, and yet they were thermally throttling. The GPU was dialing back its performance because of temperatures. So when repair shops got access to them, they had access to a kind of non-public stats reading tool, which allowed reading of the hotspot temperatures, and they were actually showing like 107 degrees in the hotspot temperature, despite the publicly accessible temperature reading seeming completely okay. But until today, with the 50 series GPUs, there was no good way for just a normal user to access those hotspot readings. But that has now changed. I saw this article here on videocards.com saying that Hardware Monitor 1.65 restores NVIDIA's RTX 50 hotspot temperature monitoring, and I can confirm that that is correct. So if you go to CPUID.com, who does this software, and I'll link this in the video description, and just side note, please only download this software from the official website, which I will link in the video description, because with hardware monitoring programs and things like that, oftentimes there's versions of these programs hosted on third-party sites, but there is nothing stopping the people from hosting those sites from bundling those with malware. And so it's really important to make sure you're downloading these kinds of tools directly from the actual source rather than those third-party sites. Other than that, this should be safe. This is a well-trusted hardware monitoring tool that tons of people use. That being said, whenever you're downloading third-party executables onto your PC, use at your own risk, etc. But this is a well-known one that should be trustworthy. Now, in their latest update, they do say hotspot temperature on NVIDIA RTX 50 GPUs has now been added. You can download it here, install it, and I did so, and it is working. Now, there's no word on how they were able to suddenly do this, whether NVIDIA updated their public API to expose these sensors, or whether the makers of this program were just able to figure out how to access the sensors in some other way. I find it interesting that this is happening in an update that came out just days after that other article was out talking about that more not publicly available software having access to these sensors in some way. So I don't know if they figured out something out through there. But the point is, the hotspot temperature is now available. Now, by the way, if you're not used to this program, if you first open this up, there's going to be so much stuff to scroll through. So if you look at here, you can use these little minus tools because this exposes stuff not just on your GPU. This is showing all of the sensors on your hardware on everything. So here's my motherboard. I'm going to go ahead and minus that. I also minused out my CPU and my RAM sticks and my SSDs. And here's my RTX 5090. This is the Founders Edition if you're curious about the temperatures that I'm getting. And now under the temperature readings, we see the GPU temp, which is what NVIDIA wanted you to see. And then now we're also getting a hotspot and a hotspot number 2. Now, a little bit of note on how to read this. First of all, I tried to find out what's the official difference between hotspot and hotspot number 2. I'm seeing some articles reporting that hotspot number 2 is a reading on the VRM temperatures, but I haven't seen that officially confirmed by CPUID or anybody, so I don't actually 100% know if that's true. That's just what I'm seeing reported. Also, you're going to get 3 values here. So what are they? The value column is what the current reading on the most recent tick where it monitors the sensors is showing you. The next one is the minimum reading, the smallest reading since you've opened up the program to start monitoring. And the third column is the maximum temperature that it's seen since you opened up the program and started the monitoring. So that's how you would read that. So you can see that currently mine's kind of bouncing around in kind of the mid to low 80s for the hotspot temperature. And I should also note that when you're testing this out, you should be in a game or some other programming, a benchmark tool, something that's stressing out your GPU, something that's really loading up the GPU to a high level of workload so that you can see what the GPU does when it's under stress, not just when you're on like your desktop or something like that. Because I've seen some people confused by that. So yeah, you do need to actually give the GPU a heavy workload. So here I'm in Cyberpunk and I've got path tracing enabled, so I'm loading up all those ray tracing cores. I'm also doing some upscaling, which does relieve some burden on the GPU, but I'm still GPU limited here, but I also want to make sure any tensor cores are working. Like I'm really trying to just load up the GPU. So that's what we're seeing. So like I said, the Nvidia sensor is telling me mid-70s. And even if you've been using something like MSI Afterburner, which I could load up here, these kinds of programs, it'll pop up in the top left in just a second. It takes a second to enable. We're also previously just showing you that... is it not going to pop up? Well, anyway, it should pop up in the top left, but even if it doesn't, oh, there it is. Okay, so programs like that on the 50 series GPUs also only exposed the kind of average temperature, and you can see that matches what the Nvidia software is showing. The Nvidia software, I'm using Alt-Z to get open the overlay. I'm enabling GPU temperature as one of the things that I'm monitoring, and you can hit Alt-R as a hotkey to turn on and off those Nvidia measurements. So either way you're looking at that, I didn't have access to this. So that's where Hardware Monitor comes in. If I now open this program up, we now can see these temperature readings. I'm stressing the GPU. Now, as far as what would be concerning if you're not sure what to look for. So the general kind seems to be kind of the advice that goes around all sorts of, hardware forums and overclocking forums, although it's hard to get like Nvidia to pin down an exact statement on this. I've tried to look for official sourcing of this, is basically that if there's about a 15-degree or so gap between the average GPU temperature that it's reporting and the hotspot temperature, then you're probably fine as far as not needing to like repaste your GPU to improve its thermals. But if there's like a significantly larger than like a 15-degree gap between the average temperature and the hotspot temperature, that could indicate that maybe like your thermal paste on your GPU could be drying up, or it could be somehow in other way a poorly seated or poorly contacting cooler mount. Things like that. So that's what you might want to be looking out for. Now, I'm not saying like if it's 16 degrees panic, because 15's okay, right? It's more like you're looking for kind of an extreme difference. So here we can see that mine seems to be within that kind of normal gap. Also, you can look at just what is the maximum temperature. So it seems like when you can get statements from, like, I remember with AMD's 6000 series cards, I think they made an official statement that if you're, below, I think it was either 100 or 105 or might even been 110 on your hotspot temperature, it's technically within spec. Now that's pushing it. I think most people would be kind of scared to see it go over 100 C. And even in the mid 90s, like, I don't love that. But these temperatures that are kind of bouncing around in the mid 80s, and it may be spiked up over 90 briefly, but we're usually in the mid 80s. For a hotspot temp, I wouldn't be too concerned. If that was the average GPU temp, I wouldn't really be loving being in the 80s. But that's kind of some rules of thumb on what to look for. So if you're seeing like the average GPU temp sitting at like 70 or 75, but the hotspot temp, if this was well over 100, that's where we might be seeing some issues where I'd be concerned about my thermal paste or my cooler in some other method. Now, there's another thing that you can look for here that can be useful, which is if you scroll down on the GPU stuff a little bit more to performance, it can also tell you what is limiting your performance. It'll either read a 0 if it's not limiting the performance, or it'll read a 1 if that currently is what's limiting the performance. So this is telling me that I am power limited right now. That means that if I went into like an overclocking tool and I allowed my 5090 to use more power, then I would probably get more performance. I'd get higher frames per second in my game, most likely. You could try it out. Now, when you overclock, you might not be stable, right? Your games could crash. So there's all sorts of things that go into that, and this isn't an overclocking guide. But that's indicating that if I gave my GPU more power, I could potentially get more performance. Now, but notice that one of these says temperature limited, and right now that's reading zeros. If you are seeing this as a 1, or if it in its max column at some point had reported as a 1, that would mean that your GPU is getting some sensor reading a high enough temperature that it's choosing to downclock your GPU and reduce your performance because of the temperatures. So that's another place where you can look to see if your temperatures are concerning and costing you performance. So that's, like I said, another useful thing in here you can look at if you're trying to see if your temperatures are a problem that's costing you performance in your games. All right, hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. I think it's really nice that we now have a tool that does seem to be reading the hotspot temperatures as far as I can tell. Like I don't have any way to confirm this with some other program or anything, but it's spitting out numbers that seem to be reasonable for what I would suspect here. It does seem to be working properly. And yeah, I think this would be a very useful tool for 50 series users to finally get some information that Nvidia didn't seem to want to give you with the 50 series for reasons. Anyway, I hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and you have an excellent day.